Welcome to another of the E-Biology Teacher Podcasts. I am Mr. Doc, and today we are talking about a subject that has made many of college students and pre-med students and even medical students cringe at the thought, and that is organic chemistry, and specifically biochemistry. All right. Now you may be saying to yourself, this is a biology course, why am I studying chemistry? Well, it may surprise you to note that life is nothing but a series of chemical reactions that allow us to sustain those properties of life. Now, I'm not saying there's no meaning to it. I'm just saying that if we boil it all down, we can find that there are chemical processes that happen that keep us alive on a day-to-day basis. And if we understand those processes, then we understand a lot more about life than we ever could just by looking at the organism as a whole. All right. So to understand that, we need to understand the parts that go into it, and that's what we're going to hit today. Now, I had to mention that organic chemistry is something that's very scary. First of all, let me note that we're not going to go in that deep on this particular podcast, but we are going to cover some stuff that can be very tricky. However, I don't think it's that bad if you keep yourself organized in your mind. All right. So just keep that in your head, and keep in mind that we're going to keep it basic, but we're also going to go into the important stuff, because this stuff is incredibly important. And if you understand this, then a lot of the stuff that we cover this semester will be a lot easier. In this podcast, we're going to talk about the importance of carbon. We're going to talk about functional groups that help make the compounds that are essential to life. We're going to define those compounds that are essential. We're going to talk about the parts that not only make them up, but the different results that we can get. And finally, we're going to hit on one thing that's very important, and that is enzymes, which we'll talk about when we get into protein. So let's go ahead and get started. In chemistry, there are two categories of chemistry. You have organic chemistry, which is the chemistry based on carbon, and then you have inorganic chemistry, which are compounds that do not contain carbon, with a very few exceptions. Now, there are 92 naturally existing elements on the planet, and there are even more that are man-made. So why is carbon so special? Why does carbon get its own category and every other 91 naturally occurring element be lumped into another side? Well, when it comes to life, carbon is the man. Carbon is the one thing that builds everything up when we talk about life. As a matter of fact, if you're a sci-fi freak, you might recognize the term carbon-based life form. Well, that's because that's what we are. We're carbon-based life forms, all right? So let's take a look at why carbon is so particularly special. You see, carbon is a lightweight atom, that can bond with 1, 2, 3, 4 things at the same time, including other carbon atoms, which allows it to build pretty much anything we want it to build. All right? What does that mean? Well, that means that carbon is like the biological Lego. Okay? Now, that sounds a little cheesy, but think about it. Legos can attach to pretty much anything, right? So I can attach this weird piece here, right? And I can attach, let's see here, I can attach this thing here, right? And I can add another little piece like that, and all of a sudden I'm building something. But if I take all these things apart, then what I can do is add different things and then build something completely different. So carbon allows us to be very versatile in the things that biologically we can build inside our own bodies. So carbon is sort of like the Lego of life. We build everything from it. We can build long chain-like structures that make up muscles. We can build ring-shaped structures that make up carbohydrates and all kinds of stuff. We can store energy in Legos because of the bonds that we make. I mean, pretty much anything we need, we can make out of carbon. All right, so that's why carbon is so essential to life. Now, what we do have in organic chemistry are small groups of elements that form molecules that we can attach to these carbon-based molecules that end up giving us completely different shapes and completely different functions. And we call those functional groups, by the way. Functional groups are groups of molecules that we attach to these carbon-based molecules that provide us with a particular function. And here's a chart that we see to explain that process. So what we've got here is a hydroxyl group that's composed of an O and an H. We have a carboxyl group that has carbon, oxygen, and hydrogen in it. And we have an amino group which has nitrogen and 2 hydrogens. And we have a phosphate group that's composed primarily of oxygen, phosphorus, and hydrogen. Now, do I really care that you know all of these and exactly what's in them? Probably not. But what I do want you to notice that these can all attach to similar molecules, and all of a sudden the molecule behaves in a very different way. For example, all of these molecules have 2 carbons in them. But look at how drastically different the shape is between all of these molecules based on the functional groups that we've added, right? And if we know anything in biology, we know that shape will determine function, okay? Shape will determine what it is that we are able to accomplish. So let's say that I have the same molecule here, this Lego that we talked about, but now what I'm going to do is I'm going to add different functional groups. Well, now these guys are different shapes, which means these 2 molecules can do completely different things. These 2, different shape, different function. All right, so that's why functional groups are important, because they provide us variety. And if you remember in our early discussions, we talked about unity and diversity. That is, things can be different and the same. Well, all 4 of these are based off the same 6-carbon molecule, but because the functional groups are there, they're all different and therefore do a different job. All right, so let's get into it. Let's talk about the essential compounds, but first let's talk about how we build them. First of all, the word mono means one, the word poly means many, micro means small, and macro means large. So in carbon compounds there are things called monomers. Those are single parts, little bitty parts that are going to make up the whole. Now the monomers build up a larger structure that we refer to as a polymer, and a polymer is basically a whole bunch of monomers stuck together. And large polymers are often referred to as macromolecules. So mono meaning one piece, poly meaning multiple pieces, and macro meaning a large piece. So let's continue our Lego analogy, right? This would be a monomer. This would be a polymer because there's 2 of them, right? And this would be an even bigger polymer because this polymer is made up of a whole bunch of the same pieces. All right, so monomer, polymer, monomer, polymer, right? Another analogy would be if you are building a house, the bricks are monomers and the actual house is the polymer. All right, so let's move on. There are 4 essential molecules of life. Each plays a specific role in the chemistry and the organism itself. Carbohydrates, proteins, lipids, and nucleic acids are the 4 essential compounds. Here's what we're going to do. We're going to take each one of these compounds one at a time, and we're going to look at the monomers, the chemical formula. We're going to look at the polymers, and most importantly, we're going to look at the function. In other words, what does that molecule actually do? All right, so let's start with carbohydrates. The carbohydrates to monomer to carbohydrates, excuse me, are monosaccharides, which literally translated means single sugar. Examples of monomers are glucose, fructose, and galactose. Notice the OSE ending, by the way. That's very helpful to recognize carbohydrates. That's how we would identify its name. Its general formula is CH2O. Now, that doesn't mean that there's one out there that's CH2O. It means that for every carbon you have 2 hydrogens and 1 oxygen. So if it's C6, then you would have H12O6. If it's C12, then it would be H24O12. The polymer for carbohydrates are di or polysaccharides, and their primary use is energy and storage. Now, you probably know carbohydrates as carbs. Carbs are located in anything that has starch or sugar because starch is an example of a complex carbohydrate or a polysaccharide. So that also explains why if you eat a lot of candy, candy is made up of a lot of sugar, which are very simple, right? This is a monomer, this is a disaccharide because there's only 2 of them. Well, we can break this down pretty easily, get the energy that's in here out, but then once we've burned it, it's gone, right? Which is why when you eat a lot of candy, you get all worked up and then you just crash, right? Because you've used up all the energy. However, if you eat like pasta, potatoes, bread, those have complex carbohydrates. These take a little longer to break down, but provide us a longer term energy supply, so we don't get that crash and fall effect. It also explains why somebody who's, say, running a marathon might eat a pasta dinner as opposed to a buffet of candy. All right? Let's go to proteins. Proteins are made up of amino acids, that's their monomer. They are made up of a carbon, which you see in this diagram, a hydrogen, a carboxyl group on one end, amino group on the other end, and what we're going to call the R group on the opposite end. Now that R group can change, and every time we get a new R group, we get a new amino acid. All right. Now the polymers for amino acids are called dipeptides, which would be 2 amino acids, or polypeptides, which would be multiple amino acids. Hair, horns, skin, muscle, and biological catalysts are all examples of proteins. Now there's one of those that doesn't sound like it belongs, but let's take a look. First of all of those things have in common is that they are structural in nature. That means that they provide some sort of form, right? Muscles, for example. But remember, muscles and horns don't really have a whole lot in common, except that they're made of protein. That's because protein can take multiple shapes. We can fold it and make it harder, right? Well, there's even protein in plants, right? Nuts and beans, those are all have a high amount of protein, the way I've always been taught is that the plants that have a lot of protein in them are going to have harder structures. You know, beans are kind of sturdy and hard. Nuts have those hard shells. That means they're probably going to have a whole lot of protein. That's a rule of thumb. I don't know that that's a standard rule. But that's what proteins are. They're made up of amino acids. Now let's take a look at a special type of protein that's called an enzyme. An enzyme is a specific type of protein that acts as a catalyst. And in our previous discussion we said that a catalyst was something that speeds up a reaction by lowering the activation energy. Now once a substrate, which is the stuff that an enzyme is going to break down, comes in touch to the active site of this enzyme, what's going to happen here is those are going to fit like a lock to a key, and that's going to break apart. So the enzyme has this space right here where the substrate will fit just like a lock to a key. That means that the shape of the substrate and the shape of the enzyme must match, and that's what we refer to as the induced fit model. Hold on one second. You done? All right. Go. All right. So there is your induced fit model of enzyme action. So here's what we're going to do now. We're going to move on, and if you go, well, I really don't completely understand enzymes just yet, well, that's okay, because I'm going to do another lecture on enzymes later, and you can download and watch that. So, all right, here we go. Our next essential compound are lipids. Lipids monomers are fatty acids. Say that correctly. Because that can get tricky. The general formula is that you have a long carbon chain, which you see in the diagrams, along with a carboxyl group on one end and then what we're going to call an X group on the other. Now the X group can change, giving you different fatty acids. Okay, polymers are they're depending on the X, whatever the X is, you can have different types of polymers. For example, triglycerides are polymers that are made up of 3 chains of fatty acids with the alcohol group on the X end. Phospholipids are actually made of chains of 2 fatty acids, and they have a phosphate group on the other end. Waxes, on the other hand, have an alcohol chain on the other end. So as we change that X group out, we get different fatty acids. The primary use of lipids is energy storage and for making membranes. Another thing that it's good for is insulation as well, because they can keep in heat. There is something special about lipids. What we need to understand is that the carboxyl group of a lipid, that end, is attracted to water, what we call hydrophilic. The term hydro meaning water, the term philic referring to love or liking. The other end is hydrophobic. Now we know hydro means water, and we're probably familiar with arachnophobia, which is the fear of spiders, and we're probably familiar with claustrophobia, which is the fear of closed spaces. So if we know phobic, we probably mean fear. Well, that means that fats have one side that really likes water and one side that doesn't, which explains why if we pour fat into water, it separates, right? Well, hold on a minute, you said fat. That's right, lipids are fats. Basically mean the same thing, right? So that is why we're looking at, when we look at lipids, we're talking about the ability to separate itself from water. That's why they're really good at membranes, because they have the ability to regulate how much water moves through a membrane because of that hydrophobic, hydrophilic nature. Now, if you happen to have a bottle of lotion around, what you might note is that if you look at the ingredients, you're going to find ingredients that sound like petroleum and linoleic acid and palmic acid. Well, those are palm oil and other oils. Well, that's because what a lotion does is it provides a coating to prevent moisture from leaving your skin, because fats are hydrophobic, meaning that if we put a layer of fat on our skin, the water is not going to escape as easily. That's the whole point of lotion. Now, most lotions have a moisturizing ingredient along with that fat ingredient, and that's going to keep the moisture, it's going to add moisture in, and then it's going to lock it in. That way we don't dry out our skin. And as you can tell, people are starting to come in, so school's getting ready to start, so I better hurry up. All right. Now, I do want to show you one other thing real quick here. If you look at this chain here, you'll notice that it looks kind of like a bus diagram, and that all the seats are full. That is what we call a saturated fat, whereas this one over here has open seats on the bus. That is called an unsaturated fat. As a matter of fact, because there is more than one seat open, this is referred to as a polyunsaturated fat, because we learned that the word poly means many, and if there was only one seat open, it would be a monounsaturated fat. Well, how do we tell the difference between a saturated fat with all the seats full and a unsaturated mono or polyunsaturated fat like this one where the seats are open? Saturated fats are solid at room temperature. Unsaturated fats are liquid at room temperature. So yes, butter is a saturated fat. Lard or pig fat or bacon grease, those are all saturated fats. Whereas, let's say, olive oil, grapeseed oil, vegetable oil, canola oil, peanut oil, those are all unsaturated fats. All right? The last one we're going to talk about is something that you probably already are familiar with, and that is nucleic acids. Nucleic acids are two terms that you're familiar with because the word nucleic acid appears in deoxyribonucleic acid, which you know is DNA, and ribonucleic acid, which you know is RNA. The monomers are nucleotides, which you probably already know are adenine, thymine, cytosine, guanine, and uracil. They are made of a phosphate group, a carbon sugar, and a nitrogenous base, and their job is to store and transfer information for cells. All right? DNA and RNA, an essential molecule of life, and we know that because in our early studies we realized that to be alive you have to have the ability to have heredity, and to have heredity, yes indeed, you must be able to have DNA. All right, now let's take a look at a DNA molecule. You're probably familiar with this diagram. The little dot right there is a phosphate group. That structure right there that you see the little hand on is a sugar, and that's a nitrogenous base. So this thing right here is your monomer, a nucleotide. That means that this is a monomer. That means that this is a monomer. This is a monomer. That's a monomer, that's a monomer, and hopefully you get the idea. Keep in mind the importance of DNA and RNA is to transfer information. It tells the cell what to do. So even the things that our body does is chemically based, because the instructions are written in a chemical compound that's based on carbon, which is why understanding organic and biochemistry is so incredibly important. Not only do we get our energy, we store our energy, we regulate what comes in and out of our cells, which we call homeostasis. It makes up the structures that we are, and it tells our bodies what to do. All of that is chemically regulated through organic and biochemistry. So yes, it is indeed important. Let's take a look at our objectives and see what we learned. Well, I just answered that first one, didn't I? The importance of carbon bonding in molecules is that it can build pretty much anything, which means that that's what everything in our body is practically made up of, and that is why we have all of the abilities that we have as living organisms. Functional groups are small groups of molecules that we can add to molecules to give them particular functions to make them behave the way we want to. The four essential compounds are carbohydrates, proteins, lipids, and nucleic acids. Now, the monomers and polymers. The monomers of carbohydrates are monosaccharides. The polymers are polysaccharides. The monomers of proteins are amino acids, and the polymers are called polypeptides. The monomers of lipids are called fatty acids, and the polymers can either be triglycerides, phospholipids, or waxes, and there are a couple of others that we didn't cover. And finally, nucleic acids. The monomers are nucleotides, and the polymers are DNA or RNA. Keeping in mind that monomer means building block. It means one little chunk, and polymer means a whole bunch of those chunks put together to build the structure that is we want. Monomer, polymer, monomer, polymer, monomer, polymer. All right. Finally, let's talk about the induced fit model of enzymes. Now, I'm going to show you one thing, but I'm not going to ruin the punchline for another one. This is the substrate, DNA. This is the enzyme. We put it in, and we unlock our molecule. That's how enzymes work, like a lock to a key. Pretty much simple as that. That's what we call the induced fit model. That's your lecture on biochemistry. Our next one's going to be on enzymes, so I hope you enjoy it. And as school is getting ready to start in the next 5 minutes, I gotta go. If you have any more questions, watch the podcast again, ask me in class, or log on to Mr. Doc's online lab, where hopefully there's a little more information for you. See you later.